Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dan Nessel Show. I'm your host, Dan Nessel. You may not know this about me, but back in the day, I started my own company. I had Rich Dad Poor Dad on the brain. I quit my job and I started an editing and translation company in Tokyo. It was called In Writing, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And it was a blast. I got clients. I survived. My wife worked with me and we stayed married. So that's all good things. It's a good sign that things were going well. But when I shut it down, it was to go work for a client. I never built a real sustainable business. It was unscalable based on a set of skills that I had, and based on a whim, to be frank with you. But looking back, I think, hey man, what if I actually built a company? Like, what if I worked it, grew it, and exited? I could have made a nice little nest egg or much more. Maybe I could have even gotten to that illustrious or hard to achieve $1 billion exit. I'm only half joking because my guest today has proven again and again that he knows what it takes to engineer a $1 billion exit. He's a CMO, has successfully helped grow 7 startup companies from early stage to going public or being sold, resulting in $5 billion in shareholder value. Most recently, he helped cybersecurity firm Thycotic build a sales and marketing strategy that took a flat revenue startup to a $1.4 billion exit in 5 years. How? It's got a lot to do with digital marketing strategies, and he's laid them all out in a terrific book, High Velocity Digital Marketing, which we'll talk about today. He's the former CMO and Chief of Staff of Thycotic, the 2019 Cybersecurity Marketer of the Year, the author of Be a Startup Superstar, and now High Velocity Digital Marketing. So please prepare to get a little bit geeky on marketing and startups and tech. And welcome to the show, Steve Kahan. Steve, it is very good to see you. Thanks so much for coming along.
Dan, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I hope I didn't overstretch it in the intro there a little bit, but you really have done quite a bit of, what some people might even say like it's miracle making, and especially those of us who have had an entrepreneurial bone in our body every now and then and never really took it to the extent. We look at what you've done here, and it's sort of like, woulda, coulda, shoulda. But you started out just like any of us in comms and in marketing, and grew up into your career as a startup sort of superstar. And can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how that all happened, a little bit about your background and what got you into all this stuff?
Yeah, so I found that the traditional path from school to climbing the corporate ladder, at least for me, could not only be high risk for my career, it could almost feel like a death trap.
No.
And I recall that my father used to tell me so many times when I was growing up, he would say, Steve, get your degree, go to work for a large corporation, you work hard, they'll take care of you, and you will have a great career. And so that was the path that I took. And I got my degree, went to work for a large corporation, and I'll never forget one day when I was sitting in my cubicle staring at this pile of claims that I was supposed to process that day.
Oh.
And then looking at my bank statement where I had $50 left in my bank account. And the student loans used to take a hold of my paycheck before my paycheck ever even had a chance to hit my bank account. And I was wondering, how on earth will I ever get ahead? And so one day I asked myself a really important question. And that question was, how could I earn a great living doing what I love? And I quickly realized that working for a large corporation in sort of a pigeonhole role where advancement was slower, the organization was far more bureaucratic, was not who I was. I was very much entrepreneurial, or at least so I thought I was. And I decided to make the leap to the startup world at that point. And quite frankly, I've never looked back.
Well, when you say you leapt to the startup world, did you like just one day decide to quit your job, or did you take it kind of safe and find a role like most of us do, or was there an opportunity? How did that happen?
Yeah. So I started researching startups and I made every single possible mistake that one
Mhm.
could ever make when I joined my first startup. I remember on my first day when I got a job at a startup, and I remember I was so excited because I was working with these super cool entrepreneurial people who just had values that I just were so much in common with mine. And I remember looking out at my office, and I was hired into marketing. I was the only person in marketing. And I remember that on my first day, I looked at the office next to mine, and they were putting the copy machine on a dolly and literally rolling it right out of the office. And I came to find out the very next day it was because the company couldn't afford to pay for that copy machine. But I was blind to it. I was working with a team of crazies that were hell bent on changing the world, changing the way applications were being developed. And I just sucked my teeth into the role. And because I was the only person in marketing, I got a chance to do everything. If it was going to get done, it was going to be on my shoulders. And literally, just a few years later, that company that couldn't afford to pay for the copy machine, it went public. And that's when
Ooh.
I got the bug and never left that startup world. I made every mistake in the world choosing that first startup. I've learned how to separate a startup that has a good chance for success versus
Mhm.
one that doesn't. I didn't know it then. I was a little lucky, but it was an incredible ride, and the outcome was fantastic.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point though about, being able to choose a startup. When you think about that, you think about investors choosing where to put their money. You think about, consumers choosing now which product or brand to trust. If you think about, am I going to choose to work with a startup to buy something from a startup? Or I'm going to choose to buy something from an established brand. I think we all know, by the way, that it doesn't matter anymore, for the most part, from the consumer standpoint. And we'll get into that, I think, when we talk about why it doesn't matter with your book, especially. But you're talking about like working for and putting your sweat into a startup. I think is that what you meant by how to choose a startup? And
Yeah. So like
yeah.
what I have learned is that if you go talk to CEOs at small startups, like every single one of them has a great story. The problem is being able to decipher those that have a great story versus those that also have a great story as well as a great chance to actually succeed. And what I've learned to look for are the following attributes that have served me well. The first thing that I look for is quality people who share your values. And what I've learned is that people reflect the company's culture. And if you don't think you could respect, trust, and admire the people that are involved in that startup, move on. And what you're looking for is a solid team of leaders that rock your world. And you
Mm.
can research what these people are saying online really easily beyond just the interview process to get a good sense of whether or not that's the type of management team that you want to work with. The second
Yeah.
attribute that I look for is a concept that fills a big market need. And the bottom line is that buyers typically don't spend money on nice to solve problems. They spend money on must solve problems. And what I look for is a company that plays within a big market. And again, you could do research online and find that out. And I'm never concerned when I see that there's big competition in the market. I'm always concerned when I see that there's next to no competition in the market because it
Mhm.
suggests that there isn't a big market. The next attribute that I look for is a great product that you could believe in. And at the end of the day, does the company provide a product or service that resonates with you, one that you would actually purchase or recommend? And you want to go to work every day with a passion for the products that the company creates, as well as your role in creating it. And so if you can't get behind it with enthusiasm, it's probably not a good choice. And then finally, I look for whether the startup itself is well funded. And naturally, you want to choose a startup that has a long enough runway to get off the ground and ask, right? I mean, a lot of people are often viewing that during the interview process that it's one way. It's not. And so make sure that the company is properly capitalized so you have the best chance for growth as well as stability. Those are the attributes that I've learned to look for that help me screen the better startups from those that might not be so.
It's interesting because, I mean, these principles can be applied really to any move you're going to make as a professional, or even as an up and comer, or somebody who's established. Or at least 3 out of the 4 of them, I would say, definitely. The fourth, is it well funded, might not necessarily apply to a Fortune 500 firm, or to an ongoing concern that we know. But are the books like legit? Is a question to ask maybe instead of that. Or how are they doing? What's the financial performance like? But I wouldn't want to take a job, if I didn't like align with the values. If I didn't think the people were incredible in some way. I think about
at the end of the day, what you're doing and what I've done is that when I evaluate startups, I typically approach it like I'm an investor, right? Because at the end of the day, in many ways, I am, because what I've learned over the years is that you may progress in your career and you may make more money as your career progresses, and that's great. But a funny thing happens. You get married, you buy a nicer car, you go on cool vacations, and your expenses somehow seem to go up almost in relation with that more money that you make.
Weird. It's weird how that happens.
And so what separates you and gives you the opportunity to break out from the pack are stock options, right? And so if you choose the right company, and even if your expenses go up as your salary does as well, but you get into the right company and the value of those options grow, that's when you could create real separation financially and not only succeed personally and professionally, but also see it reflected in your bank account.
You're making me want to sort of ask you a question about. Oh, since you're making me, I'm going to ask the question anyway, about an experience like that I had, and like in retrospect, maybe you can point out the bad choice, where the bad choices were, what the warning signs were. So when I was, I don't know, roughly 27, 28, I don't know, somewhere around the time of the first .bomb era, Y2K was on the horizon, but it's turned out to be a nothing burger. And then, we're wondering, so where should I work? And there was a whole bunch of these cool companies popping up in Tokyo at the time, because that's where I was. But I imagine that's the criteria should hold, right? No matter where you are. So I was a recruiter. I had some recruitment experience. I was pretty decent with people. I spoke enough Japanese to get by. So I was hired, or I was attracted to a company that was like this cool startup led by a non-Japanese person in the coolest section of Tokyo. And, I went on the interviews, and like partly I needed a job, but partly he's like, okay, you have 6-8 months of recruitment experience. How would you like to lead a recruitment team? We're going to bring you in. You can speak some Japanese. We're going to build this new business. You're going to be employee number 7. And it's going to be the biggest online recruitment firm that Japan has ever seen. And from there, we're going to take it global. Now, this is the time that Monster.com had just started up, that all these other like online recruitment firms were starting. And, I just thought I thought he was a cool guy, but I didn't have any sense of where the company was going. I was just like, oh, I get to work in Shibuya. I get to work in this great place. So I signed on. And, I guess I started doing okay, but then I realized very soon that, I'd be, we're building a recruitment database as we go, sort of trying to get it right. And it was working okay. But I was asking things like, do we need a license? No, we wouldn't need a license for this. It's okay. Don't worry about that. We don't need a license. Just, these people have submitted their resumes and we can just go and recruit them. Okay. So what's our fee structure? Oh, our fee structure is like, we're going to tell people that it's this percent, but we'll actually cut deals. And this is the kind of talk that was happening all the time. I wasn't a very financially savvy guy at the time. Maybe I still am not, but anyway, I started working and within 6 months we had management change. Within another couple of months, we had several more management changes. I kept with it as long as I could until finally I was like, I can't take this anymore. It just started getting, the deals were going, but I was seeing less and less of the bonuses. Nobody was promising me any stock options. And finally I left for a marquee brand. But that was my big startup experience with this firm in Japan. So do any of the, obviously it's far in memory. I'm a little short on the specifics, but any red flags there from your immediate purview?
So obviously all I know about it is the brief description that you provided, but the one thing that stuck out to me was at least my perception around that the product, if you will, that you were providing was not uniquely differentiated in the market. It sounded a lot like a Me Too. And then when it's a Me Too and it's not uniquely differentiated, and sometimes that's a matter of positioning, but there's got to be some reality in that basis because buyers are smart and they'll figure it out, right? You can't fool them, and nor should you. And so it sounds to me like there was a lack of differentiation, and then it's a race to the bottom on price, right?
That's right.
And part of the differentiation could be that you're going to offer the most affordable price in the market, but then there's a whole positioning around being successful as the low price leader as well, and attributes that your product or service needed to have around that. And so it just didn't sound differentiated to me, and that's a problem.
And that reflects quite a bit of what was going on. And now more memories are coming through. We'd watch what was happening in the States for how .coms were behaving, and our CEO, who was by no means a tech mogul CEO type, he decided that he wanted to take investor money and have massive big parties and do TV advertising. Now I was not in marketing at the time. I got into marketing later, a little bit later in my career, not too much later, just a couple of years later. But had I been in marketing at the time, I would have wondered why, we're spending, like 40% of marketing budget on one day, right? On one day's event that really had no guarantee to drag it, to pull in any business, or, in the best case scenario, we would have had a commercial jingle that people caught on to. I don't know, maybe that was something to it. But, had I been a marketer at the time, and had I had your book, I might've said something like, well, is this a must solve or a nice, is this a nice to solve or a must solve? Is this a problem? This goes to the point of, is this unique? Are we doing something that nobody else is doing? Like, have we found a niche in some ways? And would it be worth the investment? And, clearly the answer is no, the company did not do well. But, that makes me think, like, going back to what you said about, and that's how you even started this, looking at evaluating startups, a concept that, that fills a market need that is a must solve and not just a nice to solve. That's how you start your book too, with that very kind of knowing the customer, getting into the audience, understanding your audience, right? So, starting from there, you recently kind of had this opportunity to, at Thycotic, we talked about that, where you turned it into $1.4 billion company for over 5 years. What was the problem? What was the situation there from like day one? And what was the must solve and the nice to solve that you kind of discovered? And could you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's really an incredible story. So the first thing is this company with the funny name Thycotic, right? And
Yeah.
it's like strike one. It sounds a lot like psychotic,
Well, isn't
right?
that the point?
And so day one, we were sort of an also ran. We were going up against a couple of bigger, better funded competitors. I had a staff and a budget the fraction of the size of those folks. As you mentioned, revenue had flatlined 2 quarters in a row. From a sales and marketing perspective, we had a very small team. International, for example, was covered by one part-time rep located in Washington, D.C. Really, we had no partners, right? And so it was a company that it played in a space known as privileged access management, which was starting to come alive a little bit. Which is all about passwords that exist on an organization's infrastructure, operating systems, databases, applications, and if bad people get a hold of that, they have the keys to the kingdom. And so what we did is we restored revenue growth in a quarter and hit our numbers every quarter for 5 years until we had that 1.4 billion exit. But what strikes me, just focusing in on kind of that niche and that differentiation, was on my second day on the job, I asked the founders and the management team that was existing at that point, I said, who's our customers? And they said, well, Steve, wait a minute. You're supposed to be this big time marketer with cybersecurity experience. You should know our customers are the VPs of IT security and chief information security officers. And I was like, yeah, got it. Thank you. And then I started interviewing a number of the company's customers. And it was really my first aha moment. And what I found was that our customers weren't these VPs of IT security at all. They were the IT admins. These were the techies in the trenches. These were the people administering systems where downtime was unacceptable, and security was one of the causes of that. And they wanted fast, easy, simple. Where they hung out online was totally different than where the people running security were hanging out online. I mean, they would never read a Gartner report, but they would read reviews from their peers. And so once I learned who the customer was, then I imagine if I would have spent a ton of money digitally marketing to the wrong customer, I would have wasted a ton of money.
I don't have to imagine that. I've seen that happen like again and again, right? And thing is, like, if you would have gone the direction of, oh yeah, it's IT security executives and so on, you would have tried for the Gartners, you would have tried to get into symposia, you would have paid a lot of money to get into these events. You might have moved the needle by 1% or 2, maybe cut a couple of good deals if your content was good enough. But it shouldn't be like, if your content is good enough, or if like try to move the needle, that you should have a much more, you can't plan that way. You can't guarantee revenue streams that way. And that's what I love about where you went with your book, especially where you're talking about, exactly that, like understanding the difference between that kind of one-offs and what's good and what's not so good.
I can teach your listeners how to do that, right? And it all starts with understanding the full context of the ideal target buyer's world. So the first thing I had to understand was, who was the buyer, right? And it was different. This was a company that was 5 million at the time. And so it wasn't like they were small, but of course we ultimately, 5 years later, we were 145 million. But they were 5 million. They didn't know who their customer was, right? And so what I had to do was I had to then go about understanding the full context of the buyer's world. And what I did was I asked a series of questions to do that, right? And I maybe I could share some of those.
Sure.
So I didn't call up and say, "Gee, what's your must-solve problem?" Right? So like I would ask questions such as questions like about the status quo, right? And the status quo is so important because it represents obviously the current situation, how that buyer conducts business now. And this really matters because you don't often lose business to a competitor as much as you lose it to the status quo,
Mm,
right? And this is when like a potential customer says to you, "Gee, we're not interested. What we've got is good enough."
mm,
Right. And so I would ask them questions. Now I'll make it like it was psychotic, but you could really insert whatever your company's is. So describe your current process for managing privileged passwords. What works? What doesn't? What are your operations for privileged password management today? How does your team stay on top of these privileged passwords and not get overwhelmed by it? And what are a few of the tools you currently use? What do you like about them? What don't you like? And so then I would ask them about their challenges. I would ask them about the benefits that they seek. I would ask them about the impacts that they expect to get for those challenges. And then here then is what I did is that I had a Google Doc and I would write down the answers that those customers gave. And so what you want to do is you want to pay very close attention to the specific language that those customers use, right? And then in your content, in your ads, you would reflect some of that language back at them.
mhm.
Because one of the major marketing fallacies is that like a creative way to describe your products stands out and wins. And what I've learned is the truth is that buyers don't care how clever your marketing department is. What they really care about is they want to work with people who understand and empathize with them.
Mhm.
And speaking their language proves that you do just that. And then when you learn all that and you're trying to create value propositions, so many organizations make the mistake of building value propositions that really suck, right?
Mhm.
And and the reason why they're oftentimes not very strong is because they're not written for what the seller cares about, right? And so a lot of
Yeah.
organizations write value propositions that just so happen to align well with what they do, right? Like in the tech industry, a lot of times this is like bits and bytes value proposition where it emphasizes more of their features and functions, and I can tell you in the tech industry, buyers don't care that you have a solution on a cloud native architecture. It's like, what does it mean for them? And so then you're crafting value propositions based on a full understanding of those customers that really address the benefits and the impacts that those buyers want to make on the company. And that's really how you go about doing that successfully.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that I'd love to point out or like to kind of tease out a little bit here. Because first of all, everything that you're talking about, you're just what all we're talking about now is just understanding the customer and just figuring out whether you have what the need is that your business is going to attempt to meet. And you're talking about a process that you need zero technical skills in order to really do, right? You just need to be able to speak with people and have the right questions. So to say you have no skills is not quite accurate. I mean, you need to know what questions to ask. But, you know, the questions that you're asking is really almost like what any consultant would ask about the business and about what people are doing, and just to get to know them, get in their head. And I will just say also for the benefit of our listeners, when you get this book, because you need to buy High Velocity Digital Marketing. When you get the book, Steve just generously puts most of these questions out there for you to use. That said, because the book is really, really a handbook in so many ways. But that said, right, there's one thing you touched on here, which is benefits and impacts. And I like the way you described it or kind of pointed that out as you wrote about it. But impact is a big word these days, right? Even my listeners know that I'm in communications, PR, and so on. Impact is such a big word for us, right? Moving away from the effect, or moving away from the results of sustainability towards what's your impact on society. Now, in this context, still, impact is something different. It's closer to akin to like the meaning that these people want to achieve in their lives, right? So,
Yeah.
how do you differentiate between that?
Like, what's differentiate impact from a benefit?
Please, yeah.
So, and you're spot on, Dan. So, first, I just want to take a step back and say is that I work with a lot of companies and portfolio companies of venture capital firms, and you'd be shocked how rarely they actually talk to their customers. Like it shouldn't be that way, and that a lot of their marketing leaders have never set up their own advisory board, their go-to people when they are thinking about doing things or they have questions. And so when you think about, never assume that the benefits a customer expresses equates to impact. Now, an impact can be a business impact, it could be a personal impact. So a real example would be saving time is a benefit, but an impact of saving time could be more time with their kids, or being able to be, it could be expressed in terms of productivity, or more time to focus on strategic items, and think of unique ways to grow the business, right? And sometimes the impact could be massive, right? And so, like, if in the case of cybersecurity, you haven't secured a certain part of your business, you're vulnerable to hackers, and or if we don't comply with certain regulations, our business might receive fines, right? And so, what you want to be doing is to be finding out what those impacts of those benefits are, and make sure that those impacts are actually meaningful. And this ultimately is how you identify that must-solve problem.
So, what did you determine was the must-solve problem at your last company, or even at in any of the places that you've been before? Like, what was like a good example of something at Thycotic, or what the must-solve problem was versus what people might have thought was the need to solve?
So, as I mentioned, these privileged passwords, there was more and more being written about them. And I found some credible third-party research that basically said 80%, this was done by Forrester, by the way, 80% of all cyber attacks are due to exposures of weak or stolen privileged passwords. And so there you go, right there, right?
Massive.
It was the primary target of the hacker, turns out, because if they get it, then they have basically administrators' access into your infrastructure and could do a lot of bad stuff. And so what we needed to do was to sort of key off of that fact, not as we saw it, but as was said by the major analyst groups. They were all saying, plus or minus 5% on the same number. And so then we talked about then how we provided the easiest, most flexible, and affordable solution for securing those privileged passwords. So our differentiation was clear, and it was really all around simplicity. And sort of a funny thing was that once this positioning was starting to work big time, our big, large public competitors started copying it, right? I mean, it is a form of flattery. And so then I did a little bit of research. And the research that I did was this. I knew that our documentation was like 30 pages long. And I researched their documentation. And what I found by looking at the table of contents, that it was over 1,500 pages. And I basically equated their product documentation as the fifth largest novel ever written in human history and trained up our partners and our sales force. And of course, they love that. And safe to say, our big public competitor lost the simplicity battle and we won it.
So that gave you the position you needed. It gave you it must have really secured a lot of relationships with your customers on an ongoing basis. And again, because it sounds to me, and just sort of as a communicator here, looking at the way that people and stakeholders react to things and behave to things, you scratch that emotional itch, like reach people by being sincere. One might say authentic, but I had a guest recently that warned me off of the word authentic because it's sort of self-involved rather than externally involved. And that's a whole nother thing, but I'm trying to be conscious of that. But being sincere is more about, the way that, you're delivering what you promise. And
yeah. I mean, absolutely. And really what it comes down to then. So once you understand who that buyer is, you understand the full context of their world, you're able to beautifully then express your value proposition, elevator pitch, etc. Right? Then it comes down to creating incredible content. Right? And what you need to do, and where a lot of organizations don't do it right, is the content needs to be where the buyers are.
Yeah.
Which means that you've got to have content at the top of the funnel of the buyer's journey when they're doing education, to the next stage when they're doing more consideration of different solutions, to the next phase when they're evaluating a solution to purchase, and through then to that ultimate purchase. And so what you've got to do, nothing zaps the velocity out of a high velocity sales and marketing model than having a gap in content across any one of those phases. And the way that you could judge whether your content, and I could give specific examples based on that buyer, the way you could judge whether your content is great, I'll make it real simple for listeners, is that if you're growing visitors to your website quarter in, quarter out, and you maintain at least a 5% website visitor to lead conversion rate, you are producing great content. And let me tell you what that means. So it means that you're doing things that, like, if you're like me, I almost never put my name, address, email, and phone number in a form online. And the reason why I don't do it is because I don't want to get hounded by reps. And so, like, that's how everybody feels.
Yeah.
Right. And so the content has to be so good, so compelling, that your ideal target buyers will actually do that. And if you have at least a 5% website visitor to lead conversion rate, you've got pretty damn good content.
You're pulling people in over that hurdle because you're connecting with them with what matters in the center of their, like, either emotionally, they're sharing your opinions, they're sharing your feelings. There's a model that my friend Brooke Ellis has spoken about in her great book, Conversations That Connect. And it's mostly focused on social media and social customer service, but the concept is the same with your content, and the way that you deal with people is there's a hierarchy of the way you connect with someone or the way you don't connect, right? On the lowest part of the hierarchy, which is really where you're not going to connect, is with cliches. And that's the way most marketers talk. And that's crappy content, right?
Let me give you an example of great content based on sort of, and these could be, hopefully this spurs on a few ideas for some of your listeners.
Yeah.
So let's just stay with the examples just by way of continuity. So I talked about those IT admins. By talking to those IT admins, here is one of the things I learned about them. That if you ask them how many of these privileged passwords they have, like almost 100% of them had no idea. And it's not surprising because like they have complex infrastructures that they're managing, right? I mean, whether it's cloud, on-premise, whatever it might be. And so we had in our paid for tool a discovery function that would go discover your privileged passwords. And I made a quick decision and said, you know what? We're going to package this up as a free tool. We're going to give away our discovery for free. We're going to then target it even further, like for Microsoft environments or Unix environments, so then I could target my marketing even more. And then we're going to provide a beautiful report that will tell them not only what they have, but what that means and what they need to do about it, right? And like that free tool flew off the shelves, unlike you could ever imagine, because it offered, right to your point, real value.
Yeah.
We had another one called the Privileged Password Risk Assessment, where a buyer could come to our website, take them about 7 or 8 minutes, answer a series of questions. And then everybody wants immediate feedback. So it would give them a grade, like they're in university, A through F. So here's your grade. Here's how you're doing. And then we would break it down in this beautiful report they'd immediately get of how they're doing against the various categories. But then we took it to the next level. Because we captured at the beginning of this report the industry, the geography, and their business size, we were then, because we were collecting a lot of this information, sent them an email the very next day with a report on how they compared versus their peers.
Ooh.
Which everybody always wants to know how they compared. They love, so this got them in the habit of opening our emails because it was real juicy value. And then because I had all of this proprietary information that nobody in the world had, I was able to create reports like the state of privileged access management, or slice and dice the data, like the state of privileged access management for financial service companies in the UK, for example. And that fed our webinars, it fed our social media, it fed PR activities based on all that differentiation. And then I took it one more step further. So many organizations don't train their sales or their partners on every single piece of content that they have. What is it? How do you interpret it? What does it mean? How do you follow up on it? So we taught our sales and our partner teams, for example, at the Privileged Password Risk Assessment, here's how you follow up. Of course, they were young, pushy salesmen for sure. But the way that they followed up was very much in a consultative manner. So they were saying like, gee, what grade did you get? How did you do? Where did you do well? Where didn't you do well? Would you be interested in learning how we can help you? And that changed the dynamic of our relationship right at the beginning of how we were perceived by potential customers, and all of which just work to dramatically accelerate revenue growth at reasonable cost.
It goes directly to something that actually you said, I think, as part of this whole content conversation in your book, which is about basically telling a whole story. So I always talk about storytelling more at a micro level, like everything that you say should be a story. There should be a beginning, middle, and an end. But the way that you've illustrated in the book, and it also goes to something you said a little bit earlier about, about stopping velocity through the funnel. If you have bad content at any stage of the funnel, it stalls the velocity. You can tell, right? You can tell if you look at your metrics. But what you're describing now is an ongoing story. It's almost like a when those theatrical universes, right? Where, you get somebody to enter universe, and then every step of the way along that funnel is kind of related to that same character arc,
Yeah.
and
And like
it's pretty cool. Yeah.
yeah, we created content stories.
Mm-hmm.
These pieces were parts of our content story, but we also had content in the educational phase. Like, again, staying with this example, like a PAM, Privilege Access Management for Dummies book, right? Or an expert's guide to educate them, to a bunch of other free tools, through to more analyst reports or tons of customer testimonials, how-to videos, right? All of which would play together, which would be our campaigns. And most importantly, we would then, from a marketing perspective, tie together these stories in beautiful, nurturing campaigns, or teach our sales reps or our partner sales reps, if someone downloads this piece of content, you probably want to offer them, one of these next pieces of content, because it takes it, one step further, right? Which accelerates velocity in the sales process.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all about, velocity is a metric that's rarely looked at and managed, but we looked at it and we managed it very tightly, at least at the companies that I've been at, because velocity is all about how fast you're bringing in money, how fast you're moving prospects through that funnel, and does your marketing and your content properly support that, right? And that's a lot of what we're talking about here, and how important piecing together your content into content stories actually are to building pipeline and growing revenue.
You know, as I'm listening to you and recalling what I've read, and it's just becoming clearer and clearer in my mind. One of the things that really sticks out now as you're describing this, and I know it comes later in the process in the book, but at every step of the funnel, and the funnel's fairly well illustrated. At every step of the funnel, though, it requires a handoff, like or a partnership, and so many companies are disjointed, like where, okay, maybe at the very top of the funnel, you're using PR and communications to kind of attract people with some earned media and some stories to kind of just get the reputation out there. Okay, they believe you, they trust you, so now they trust you, they're willing to click on something, and so on and so forth, until they click further down and they get to the discovery phase, and they get to the consideration phase, and they're figuring out where they are. But there's breakdowns all along that chain when functions don't talk to each other enough, or when they're not collaborating up front. Now, like, I would imagine in a startup, that's one of the advantages that you would have had from the beginning, to be able to build that into the sauce from the get-go. But what do you do if that's not the case? Like, what would you say to somebody who's dealing with that multifunctional disarray?
Well, what I would say, it always comes down to the metrics and the facts and the numbers.
Hmm.
And so when I see that there's breakdowns, and you'd be surprised. I mean, there could be breakdowns in small organizations as well as large organizations. And so what I always had was, we we really instrumented out our sales and marketing process in great detail, and we managed it very rigorously. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, at Thycotic, I knew not only did my visitor to lead conversion rate need to be 5%, but our lead to opportunity conversion rate needed to be at least 13%. And the average time to go from a lead to an opportunity or a pipeline was roughly 15 days.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew in our case what it should be, where we were relative to that number. We knew that our opportunity to close rate was about 22%. Our overall lead to close rate was about 3%. Our There was about 66 days, the average lead to close time, and a 10-month CAC payback. I mention these numbers because at least at some level, whether you're large or whether you're small, you need to have a grasp of those metrics, and you need to build a way, whether it's you're using salesforce.com so you could see that.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, I've always built Tableau dashboards on
Mm-hmm.
top of salesforce.com that would show me the data exactly the way I wanted to see it. And every single morning, for example, in the Thycotic journey, it's sort of a sickness of like workaholics, a little bit like me, is that I would get up literally 365 days a year. And the first thing I would do is look at my key Tableau dashboards to know where I'm at. And the beauty of it is once you build that infrastructure, one, you don't need a huge marketing ops team because it's all right there in front of you, right? Which saves money. But the second thing is it's a thing of beauty when you start training the rest of your marketing team on this and the importance of the metrics. So for example, when we would go and do trade shows, we managed our trade shows in the same rigorous fashion or events that we did our digital marketing. And when lead follow-up to those trade shows weren't within the SLA period, our head of events would be in the ear of the chief revenue officer like that next day, right? And that's when I knew that was happening, where I had other leaders on the marketing team all over the numbers and taking the right actions. That's when all of a sudden you could go, okay, this is really working. And it's just a beautiful thing to see it unfold.
That's what you're talking about is data that you arrived at, not the day that you joined the company. It took a little while to put that together.
Absolutely.
I would imagine it was an ongoing process. You probably refined it daily or weekly or monthly, maybe daily in your case. I did promise, by the way, that we would get a little geeky in this podcast, and here we are. But I think it's so important for everybody to remember, that the importance of metrics, and what you're talking about is something that you talk about in the book in your in the Martech section when you talk about the marketing stack, the and the metrics, the measurement. You go through in quite, in enough, I guess, with, I was going to say detail, but no, you actually hand the reader a blueprint for how to build this out and to talk about the different examples and give them kind of templates that they can use to figure all this stuff out. But you go through it, and when you talk about, by the time you get to the section about Martech, you've already been through the KPIs. You've already been through talking about what does the measurement need to look like. So, when you go through the book, you get it in an order that might make more sense to the listener who's listening now. But in the time that we have left, Steve, we've only gone scratch the surface of what a high velocity digital marketing funnel looks like, and I think there's a couple of maybe big points that we should bring home to our listeners, since I have you here, right? And we talked about building great content. We could spend several episodes just on that. You then go into mastering Google, as an SEO, as something to do once you have the content, and then you talk about creating the website and what that entails, KPIs, the measurement. Then we get into the Martech stack, right? Then we're getting into implementing the funnel. That's where then once you talk about that kind of infrastructure, then you get into implementation. What does HVTM look like? How do you set revenue goals? How do you build that demand generation? What is ABM? It's like a very logical kind of path. So I just want to let our readers know that we just started with part one. We've only been covered I don't know, 20% of the book. In the remaining time we have, what would be some of the things that you would encourage marketers and even PR people who are kind of listening here, that they can do now, maybe drawing from your book, but certainly from your knowledge, because it's one and the same, really. What can they do now, and what are the last things that you would point out based on what's in your book that we should leave with?
Well, so I'll offer up a couple, right? So first is you need to turn your website into a lead magnet,
Mhm.
right? And so here's a few things that your listeners can do like tomorrow, right? To improve their visitor to lead conversion rate. Put a get a quote button at the top of your homepage, right? And so I've mentioned this to portfolio companies, and I've had CEOs at companies as large as 100 million saying that's our highest converting thing that we have on our website, right? And so do that. Make sure all your forms are above the fold. Minimize friction in your forms, right? Think white space, think Google's homepage. Like there's a reason why there's all this white space. If you reduce the number of things that you're asking your web visitors from 4 down to 2, a lot of times you could get a 50% increase in those forms being filled out. Use call to actions in every single blog post, right?
Mm.
If you end a blog post by just letting someone leave a comment, then you're doing them wrong. You need to tell your blog readers to do something, ask them to do something. And you don't need like to be salesy, like have it relate to the educational blog that you just did. Offer exclusive or upgraded content, like some sort of free content. We had like Pam for Dummies, right? A For
Mhm.
Dummies book with Wiley. And then we created an upgraded a piece of content called the Expert's Guide, which then took it to the next level, which would pop up if people were on that page. Here's one more. Make sure your website is catering to mobile users,
Mm.
right? People are looking at your website on their phones, and like a lot of people look at their websites and test things on their Mac or PC all the time, but they don't look at every page on the phone, right? And trust me, a lot of your buyers or visitors, that's how they're looking at things. And so make sure that that experience, that speed, the
Mm.
ability to right size the screen, etc., works properly. Those are a few things like the listeners could do tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are very practical and doable takeaways. I've written a couple of them down myself because, in my role in communications, I don't run websites necessarily, but I know the guys who do. And, we have so many, I think, immediate kind of testing and that we could do or changes that we can make to make the customer journey a little less with less friction, as you said, like just make it smoother.
Yeah. You want an idea on
Mm.
how to improve in Google?
Sure.
So there are 500-page books on how to improve in Google, right? And look, to me, again, I'm a startup guy and my head could spin. Like, I'm not going to read a 500-page book on Google. But here's something that your listeners could do tomorrow. So we always track what we called our coveted keywords. And these were
Mhm.
the keywords that your buyers are searching, right? And you could find out by asking them, looking at some of the tools Google offers, looking at other tools that are available even for free, to figure out what are those words and what's the volume. And so we knew what they were, we knew where our placement was, and I always tracked them versus our top competitors. But what we would do is we would have our SEO expert meet with content creators at the
Mm.
beginning of every single piece of content that we created for opportunities to incorporate those keywords properly, right? And then that SEO expert would check back in right when the final draft was created to make sure we didn't miss out on opportunities that we should have those words included. Then once the content was done, we made sure it was properly exposed to Google so it could go do its thing. And then, of course, if you're creating great content, your partners are going to love it. And so then you're going to get a ton of high quality backlinks.
Yeah.
Simply by implementing a process such as that, it's not going to be like tomorrow,
Yeah.
but you implement that process and you will punch so far above your weight on Google, you'll be shocked and amazed.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I mean, just to put a little sidebar there for a second on Google itself and on SEO. I've had guests on before, and we've talked about SEO, and I think it's critically important as well. And then I have had people on say, "Look, SEO is dead. Don't play it. Don't pay attention to SEO. Just write good content because you don't have the time, and you're not going to compete with the Fortune 500 companies. If you're especially if you're like a solo entrepreneur and you don't have people to consult with, follow your basic rules of good writing. Describe the things that you want to describe. Find your keywords, but generally speaking, you're not going to beat those guys at Google."
Yeah. So let me give you my opinion.
Yeah.
They're not mutually exclusive, right? And so guess what? You could do both, right? And so do both, but also understand, and this is the important thing, you've got to be great on Google. It's why I have a chapter on it in my book, right? Where it's just practical. And the whole reason why you've got to be great on Google is this. Think about if you're going to go buy a car, right? And so are you really going to go to 10 different car dealerships to have that unique opportunity to speak with 10 different sales reps at those car dealerships? No. You're going to go to Google. You're going to Google perhaps a car that you have on your mind. Then you're going to look at other cars that maybe compete with that car, right? That could be potential alternatives. Then maybe if it's a new car, you might go to the manufacturer's site and go build it, right? Then you might go read some reviews on it. Then you might go figure out like what it should cost you. Bottom line is you're going to know as much about that car probably as the sales rep on the lot, if not more. And so where did I do all that? With and through Google, right? And so you gotta do both because it's the way in which people buy today.
And just to be clear, right? If you are aiming to appear organically in the SERPs, search engine result pages, that's an increasingly squeezed out space that's harder and harder to get into, right? But if you use a combination of great SEO plus a little bit of money, a little bit of paid, and then video and local business, kind of the different tools that are available within Google, you increase your chances greatly.
100%. Right? And when you're doing like pay-per-click, a lot of organizations, like they write crappy ads.
Yeah.
Right. And then like the calls to action are not super strong. Like, for example, when I talked about those free tools that we had, if you were searching for enterprise privilege access management, like in our space, and that free tool came up where you could discover your privilege passwords for free, like, and you worded that well, like better than I just said it, like that's money, right? And so you really gotta pay attention to it and micromanage it. And there's a lot of good firms out there, but then there's a lot of crappy ones that help you do that too. So what I've learned is that when I'm working with a firm like that, I want firms that that are so all about the numbers that it's almost like when I'm talking to them, I'm talking to like finance execs, right? And so at the end of the day, and that they can get into the analysis, they could get into numbers that would blow you away. And so that's like one attribute that I looked for when I look for partners to help us, for example, in pay-per-click.
Yeah, good agencies. And you also give that, well, first of all, your agency scoring section of of the book is focused on digital agencies. But I just want to say, put it out here right now. Anybody who has ever have to issue an RFP and has to deal with kind of listening to agency pitches, whether it's PR, whether it's marketing, social, content creation, whatever it is, you can tweak that template and use this scoring system, which you can bet is going to happen on my team. But that, as I'm stealing so many great things from this book, and thank you very
Yeah,
much
and
for
one
that,
of the
Steve.
reasons why I put that in there is that I have always had a philosophy of never having the biggest team. I just wanted a team of A+ stars
Mm.
backed by incredible agencies, right? And so then you've got to be able to select them, and that's why a lot of that criteria was built into the book to
Mm-hmm.
fully realizing that you're probably going to need some help, but you got to get the right help.
And that's so important, whether you're in marketing or any role really. You need to have, you don't have the time to be an expert in everything. You need to get that extra expertise, especially in these highly technical areas where you think, the other thing, by the way, I love in your book, and I keep saying that, I'm paying attention to the clock. The clock is mine. It's fine. We can keep going. But the whole thing about like the way that you describe, do the DIY part of Google, like you can use Google tools, you can create your own ads, you can use the dashboard yourself. You're like, none of this is a good option. Right? This is not a good option. And you say it twice. So, you can't do everything yourself. And I think it's important to know that. And especially my listeners out there who are wearing many hats, there's a limit to the hats. So choose your battles wisely, and find your agency partners when you can, or just prioritize your activities so that you can start one step at a time. And that's kind of where I wanted to sort of go with this. You don't have to do everything at once. Steve, you gave us what you can do tomorrow. On the whole, though, it's a process. There's a lot of steps you could do. They can be done in parallel. They could be done one after another. As we kind of wrap up, I just wanted to ask you, if there's absolutely one thing that you have to do now, right? What would that one thing be if you're a marketer? If that question can be answered.
I think it depends on your situation, but for me, the way people buy today has totally changed. Buyers now rely on digital content to make purchase decisions, right? Much like
Mm,
that car buying example that I gave, right? I mean,
totally.
I do that for a lot of things, as most people do, and it's backed up by the research, right? So Gartner has said that in the B2B space, that buyers spend only now 17% of their buyer's journey with potential suppliers. So this kind of new level of information parity during the buying process has really changed the way how marketers need to interact with those potential buyers to influence them towards your product and services. And so pay attention. I, as a CMO, always paid way more attention to digital content that we were creating than any other CMO that I know. And one of the questions that I'm often asked is, so you guys had like great content. How do we build great content? Because
Yeah.
we're not the same company as you. So here's what you could do starting tomorrow. What I did, beyond spending a lot of my time, was I would have meetings twice a year with the best and the brightest cross-functionally at our company, people from R&D, product management, professional services, sales engineers, and the like. And I would invite them into a meeting. I would send them examples of incredible content that was done inside or outside of our industry. And they all had a homework assignment, which was to come to the meeting with one great idea that they think our buyers would absolutely love. And so we would go to that meeting, they would present their one idea, we would prioritize them as a team, and then we would go build them. And the beautiful thing was, not only did I have more great content ideas than I could ever implement, but because I was working with the best and the brightest, I also often needed to rely on them to help me to create that content, which they were happy to do. And I paid them, like, right out of our marketing budget. The first place I would spend money was to bonus those folks to help me to produce it. And then, and because I knew that was the key to the lead gen, that was the key to everything.
Yeah.
And then once we produced that content, because they were the best and brightest, they were the leaders, they were the cheerleaders, right?
Yeah.
And so they would be out there making sure that everybody knew about it and was using it. So that's something that your listeners could do immediately to learn what great content their organizations can be delivering.
So it sounds like if you can get the content right, that's such a huge hurdle. It's not like the rest is going to fall into place. There's work to be done, but get that right. If there's anything to get right, get the content
right. But also realize, make sure that it's to the right buyer. Make sure you really understand that buyer. It's why I sort of covered the other stuff.
Yeah.
But you get that content right, and that is a big chunk of the battle.
That is, and I think a lot of my listeners will be glad to hear that, because we do have a lot of content creators, people on, who listen to us for that. And the last thing I want to ask you is, looking forward, right? What's keeping you up at night these days, Steve? Is there anything that's on the horizon for marketers, for communicators, for content creators that is like, we really need to watch this? What do you think?
Well, I would say two things. So one thing that's keeping me up at night is that people are looking for the silver bullet, that, like, hey, there's got to be like that one thing, right? And what I've learned is it's the fundamentals, right? And most organizations that I meet, even good companies, they're really not that great at the fundamentals, right? And so think of it almost like sports. I mean, they're practicing the fundamentals over and over, and there are fundamentals to being great at marketing. And so one thing that keeps me up at night is, why is it that these organizations are just blowing it on the fundamentals, like time and again? And so that's one. And then the other thing is just more for me personally, is that I've actually started book 3. And so I'm up at night writing.
That's literally keeping you up at night.
Yes.
Well, congratulations on starting book 3. And I hope it's a continuation of the work. Is it different? Is it a different thing, or is it?
I'm actually writing a murder mystery with 2 of James Patterson's co-authors.
Goodness gracious. I mean, talk about a departure from what you've done before. Was that a personal challenge, or have you been really interested in doing fiction?
Well, it was a dream of mine, and so I'm sort of a make it happen person. So I want that dream to become reality. And then I did a lot of homework, and I liked how fast a James Patterson book reads, and so I wanted to get some of that aspect. And so I started to work with 2 of his. He doesn't write that much. I mean, he works with other people that do a lot of their writing, and so 2 of them are writing with me as we speak. We're doing it together, and so far so good. We're currently 33 chapters in, on our way to about 50.
Oh, well, so you're more than halfway. Congratulations. That's a huge hurdle. And someone who is constantly working on a book of some kind, and still haven't finished it. I greatly admire the fact you've got 2 in the can, and you now are working on something completely different. The dream of so many of us is to write fiction. Well, Steve, I mean, I've clearly just love what you've done here, and I don't know how much more praises I could sing of your book, but I'll sing one more, which is the book is amazing. I think everybody needs to understand high velocity digital marketing. Just the idea of how to get through each of those steps of the process, how to really understand your buyer, customer, stakeholder, fill in the blank, and help them along through their journey and getting to know you and getting to understand your company, your services, your products, your cause, your whatever it is, whatever that conversion is, getting them through there and what to do at each step of the way, how to measure that, how to improve it. Folks, you need to get this book. I will have a link to it in the show notes and probably in the LinkedIn post as well. But again, it is High Velocity Digital Marketing by Steve Kahan. And Steve's name will be spelled properly in the episode title. So look him up on LinkedIn. Check out his website, stevenmarkkahan.com. Again, that's going to be in the show notes. But check out stevenmarkkahan.com. Steve, is there any other place that people should find you or look for you that I missed?
Those would be the two best places.
Terrific. And look, guys, I mean, check out Steve. Clearly, the guy knows what he's talking about with digital marketing. And I will just one last point. And I have to say this, Steve, because when I opened your book, I was not expecting the foreword to be written by my idol, David Meerman Scott. A lot of my listeners will know who that is. And I certainly hope all my listeners know who David Meerman Scott is, the author of The New Rules of Marketing and PR, which set me on my path to be a marketer and a communicator, a guy who knows exactly how to marry marketing and communications, who understands integrated marketing, understands the value of PR and marketing together. He writes the foreword to the book. That's enough. That should be enough for anybody to say, yeah, I'm going to buy this book. So congratulations on getting David to write your book and to write your foreword. And, any last words before we wrap it up?
I just really enjoyed myself, and it was a pleasure being with you, Dan. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening to the Dan Nessel Show. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. People always ask me, why do I do the show? I do it for the ratings. I do it for your validation. So do me a favor. Go over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or someplace else, wherever you're listening to podcasts, and subscribe, leave a review, rate me, and share with your friends. Anything you can do to spread the word, I deeply appreciate it. Thanks again for listening to The Dan Nessel Show.